Sometimes the kindest mistake changes the fate of an entire kingdom. The wind screamed through the towering pines as if the forest itself wanted every living soul to stay hidden indoors. Snow swirled across the narrow trail in blinding waves, piling higher with every passing minute, until the old wooden fence outside Evelyn Carter's cabin nearly disappeared beneath a blanket of white. She pulled her wool coat tighter around her shoulders and hurried toward the stack of firewood she had nearly forgotten before sunset. Winter in these mountains never offered second chances. A few extra minutes outside could mean frozen fingers, a twisted ankle beneath the snow, or losing the path home altogether. Just as she bent to lift another armful of logs, something caught her attention. A faint shape rested beneath the branches of an ancient cedar only 30 feet away. At first she thought it was another drift of snow, but then it moved. Barely. Evelyn set the firewood down and stepped closer despite the bitter wind stinging her cheeks. A large white wolf lay curled against the tree trunk, its thick fur dusted with ice crystals until it almost blended into the landscape. It didn't growl. It didn't bare its teeth. It simply watched her with exhausted golden eyes that seemed strangely calm for a wild animal trapped in a storm. Every lesson she had ever learned told her to back away. Every story told by the villagers warned that wolves brought only sorrow. Yet none of those stories had prepared her for the quiet sadness she saw in those eyes. "You're going to freeze out here," she whispered before she realized she had spoken aloud. The wolf lowered its head as another gust buried part of its body beneath fresh snow. Evelyn glanced toward the distant lights of the village. If anyone saw her helping a wolf, they would call her reckless. Some would call her foolish. Others would never let her forget it. But the storm didn't care about opinions, and neither did the lonely creature lying in its path. She carefully stretched out one gloved hand. The wolf remained perfectly still. After a long moment, it allowed her fingertips to brush the thick fur around its neck. It was colder than she expected. Far colder. "Come on," she murmured with a nervous smile. "You don't have to trust me forever. Just trust me tonight." The animal struggled to stand, its legs trembling before giving way again. Evelyn sighed softly, slipped one arm beneath its shoulders, and slowly guided its weight against her side. It was heavier than she imagined, yet somehow it leaned toward her instead of resisting. Step by careful step, they crossed the yard together while snow erased their footprints almost as quickly as they appeared. By the time she pushed open the cabin door, both of them were covered in white. Warm light from the stone fireplace spilled across the room, wrapping the small home in a glow that felt untouched by the howling darkness outside. Evelyn spread extra blankets beside the hearth, but the wolf shivered so violently that the warmth barely seemed to reach it. She frowned, remembering how quickly living things lost heat after hours in the storm. Without another thought, she added fresh logs to the fire, heated water for a kettle, and draped every spare quilt she owned over the exhausted animal. Still it trembled. "You're stubborn," she said gently, almost laughing despite herself. "Or maybe you're just tired." The wolf lifted its head only enough to meet her eyes again. There was gratitude there, or perhaps she imagined it. Either way, she could not leave it alone. As the fire crackled into the night, Evelyn moved her own blanket beside the hearth, close enough that the shared warmth might help both of them through the freezing hours ahead. Outside, the blizzard buried the mountains beneath endless silence. Inside, neither the lonely young woman nor the mysterious white wolf realized that before morning, the snow would hide far more than footprints. It would hide a secret powerful enough to change both of their lives forever. Morning arrived quietly, but the storm had not truly ended. Thick clouds still covered the mountains, turning the daylight into a soft silver glow that slipped through the frost around Evelyn Carter's windows. The fire had burned low during the night, leaving only gentle warmth in the little cabin, yet the white wolf no longer trembled as fiercely as before. Evelyn slowly opened her eyes, surprised to find that she had slept more peacefully than she had in weeks. For a brief moment, she forgot the unusual guest resting beside the hearth, until she heard the faint sound of steady breathing. She pushed herself upright and smiled with quiet relief. The wolf was still there, lying exactly where she had left it, its thick white coat now dry and almost shining in the firelight. It looked less like a helpless stray and more like something that belonged to the mountains themselves. As if sensing her gaze, the wolf opened its golden eyes. There was no fear in them, No anger either. Instead, it watched her with remarkable patience, as though it had already decided she was not a threat. "Good morning," Evelyn whispered, feeling slightly foolish for speaking to an animal. "I hope you are feeling a little better." The wolf blinked once before lifting its head. It moved carefully, favoring one side, but it no longer seemed exhausted. Evelyn walked to the small kitchen table and filled an iron kettle with fresh water from the barrel beside the door. Soon the comforting sound of water beginning to simmer filled the cabin. She sliced the last piece of homemade bread she had baked 2 days earlier and quietly wondered how long it would last if the roads remained buried beneath several feet of snow. Supplies were never plentiful during winter, but somehow sharing them felt easier than eating alone. When she returned with a bowl of warm water, the wolf remained perfectly still until she knelt beside it. "I think you trust me now," she said with a gentle laugh. The animal lowered its head just enough to allow her to brush away the last bits of frozen snow caught around its neck. Its fur was softer than she expected, almost impossibly clean beneath the melted ice. As her fingers passed across its shoulder, she paused. The wolf wore no collar, yet hidden beneath the thick white fur she briefly felt something smooth against its skin. Before she could look closer, the wolf calmly shifted its weight, covering the spot again. Evelyn decided not to force the matter. Everyone deserved a few secrets, even a lost creature wandering through a blizzard. Hours passed peacefully. Outside, snow continued falling in slow, silent flakes while inside the cabin the warmth steadily returned. The wolf occasionally watched the windows, listening to sounds Evelyn could not hear. More than once its ears lifted toward the forest long before distant branches cracked beneath the weight of fresh snow. It was almost as though it sensed every movement beyond the walls. By afternoon, Evelyn noticed something even stranger. Whenever she stood, the wolf quietly rose as well. When she crossed the room to gather more firewood, it followed with careful steps. When she returned to the table, it settled only after she had taken her seat. The pattern repeated again and again until she smiled to herself. "You are making certain I do not disappear, are you?" she asked softly. The wolf answered only by holding her gaze for another long moment. Somehow the silence felt like a conversation. Later that evening, Evelyn opened the front door just enough to shake snow from a blanket hanging outside. A sudden gust swept through the cabin, carrying with it the distant sound of voices. She froze. Someone was moving through the forest despite the weather. The voices were too far away to understand, but they were unmistakably human. Almost instantly the wolf stood between Evelyn and the open doorway. It did not growl or show its teeth. It simply faced the storm with quiet determination, every muscle alert as it listened. The distant voices faded as quickly as they had come, swallowed once again by the wind. After several minutes the wolf finally relaxed and stepped aside, allowing Evelyn to close the door. "Whoever they are," she murmured, sliding the heavy wooden lock into place. "I hope they found shelter." She never noticed the wolf glance toward the mountains with an expression that seemed almost thoughtful. Night settled over the forest once more, wrapping the cabin in comforting silence. Evelyn added another log to the fire before spreading fresh blankets beside the hearth. This time the wolf chose its place without hesitation, lying close enough to feel the warmth, but leaving just enough space between them to show quiet respect. Evelyn smiled as she extinguished the lantern. She still believed she had rescued an injured stranger from the snow. She had no way of knowing that beyond the frozen trees, riders were searching every trail, every valley, and every hidden cabin for someone they called their king. The following morning the storm finally began to loosen its grip on the mountains. Sunlight filtered through the heavy clouds in pale ribbons, making the endless fields of snow sparkle like scattered crystals. Evelyn Carter wrapped a thick scarf around her neck before opening the cabin door. Fresh air rushed inside, carrying the scent of pine and the distant sound of crows returning to the forest. Behind her, the white wolf remained near the hearth, watching every movement with calm golden eyes. "I will not be gone long," she said with a reassuring smile, surprised by how naturally those words escaped her lips. The wolf tilted its head slightly, almost as if it understood. Evelyn stepped outside with an empty basket, hoping to gather a few supplies before another storm arrived. The trail leading toward the village was narrow and nearly buried beneath 2 feet of snow. forcing her to move carefully with every step. The forest seemed unusually quiet. Even the wind had softened into a gentle whisper that drifted through the branches overhead. When she finally reached the first cottages at the edge of the village, conversation stopped almost immediately. Neighbors glanced toward her with polite smiles that quickly faded into curious expressions. Then someone noticed the unusual tracks beside her own footprints leading away from the woods. Large wolf prints. Fresh ones. Evelyn, an elderly woman, called from her porch. "Have you seen a wolf around your cabin?" Evelyn hesitated only for a moment before answering honestly. "I found one during the blizzard. It was freezing." A heavy silence settled over the street. Another villager slowly lowered the sack of grain he had been carrying. "You brought it inside?" he asked in disbelief. "Only because it would not have survived the storm," Evelyn replied quietly. "It has not harmed anyone." The murmurs spread faster than the cold wind. Some shook their heads. Others exchanged uneasy glances. "Wild wolves do not simply accept kindness," one man muttered. "Something is wrong." Another woman folded her arms tightly. "You should have left nature alone. Creatures like that belong in the forest." Evelyn lowered her eyes, not because she believed they were right, but because she had grown accustomed to carrying the weight of other people's judgments. She finished collecting flour, dried beans, and lamp oil before beginning the long walk home. Yet she could still feel curious eyes following her until the village disappeared behind the snow-covered hills. Back at the cabin, she stopped in surprise. A neat pile of split firewood rested beside her front porch. She frowned. She had used nearly the last of her supply the previous evening and certainly had not chopped fresh logs before leaving. She looked around the clearing, expecting to find a helpful neighbor, but there was no one. Only smooth snow stretched between the trees without a single visible footprint leading toward the woodpile. "That is impossible," she whispered. She carried the supplies inside and found the wolf exactly where she had left it. It calmly lifted its head as she entered, then looked briefly toward the stacked firewood outside before returning its attention to her. Evelyn laughed softly. "Do not tell me you know where that came from." The wolf simply blinked. As afternoon settled over the mountains, another strange discovery waited for her. The loose hinge on her garden gate, which had been broken for weeks, now swung perfectly into place. The bucket she had accidentally left outside before the storm had been returned to the porch. Even the small bird feeder hanging beneath the old oak tree had been repaired with fresh twine. None of it made sense. She had been away for less than 2 hours, and there were still no footprints anywhere around the cabin except her own. That evening, while preparing vegetable soup over the fire, Evelyn noticed the wolf staring toward the window again. Its ears lifted before a distant sound finally reached her several moments later. Horses, many of them. The faint rhythm echoed somewhere beyond the hills before disappearing once more. The wolf rose silently and walked toward the front door. Its posture remained calm, but every movement carried quiet purpose. Evelyn stepped beside it and peered through the frosted glass. Nothing could be seen beyond the falling snow. "Someone is traveling in weather like this," she murmured. "They must have an important reason." The wolf never looked away from the forest. For several long seconds, its golden eyes reflected the fading light until they seemed almost to glow against the gathering dusk. Then, without warning, it turned back toward Evelyn and gently nudged her hand with its nose. She smiled and rested her fingers against the soft white fur. "Whatever they are searching for," she said softly, "I hope they find it." Far beyond the mountains, riders wearing silver crests continued following a trail almost invisible beneath fresh snow. Their leader studied the enormous wolf tracks crossing the frozen landscape and quietly lifted his gaze toward the distant cabin hidden among the pines. Hope, after many restless days, had finally returned. The mountain seemed to awaken in ways Evelyn Carter had never noticed before. Every morning brought another quiet mystery, small enough to dismiss on its own, but impossible to ignore once they began to gather. The path leading from her cabin to the woods was always clear before she stepped outside, even after fresh snow had fallen overnight. Buckets she had forgotten to fill somehow held clean water by sunrise. A loose shutter that had rattled for months now rested firmly against the wall without a single missing nail. She searched for reasonable explanations, telling herself that perhaps she had overlooked these things before, yet deep inside she knew that was not true. Someone, or something, was quietly caring for the little cabin while she slept. The white wolf never left her sight during the day. It remained peaceful, watching her as she kneaded bread dough, swept the floor, or stitched another patch onto her worn winter coat. Its calm presence slowly transformed the silence inside the cabin from lonely into comforting. Sometimes Evelyn caught herself speaking aloud simply because it felt natural. She described memories from childhood, the flowers that would return when spring finally reached the valley, and the dreams she once carried before life became quieter than she had expected. The wolf never answered, yet it listened with such patient attention that she often smiled without realizing it. Late that afternoon, she carried a basket toward the woods to collect fallen pine branches for kindling. The wolf followed several steps behind, never crowding her, never wandering far away. The snow reflected golden sunlight as the clouds finally began to break apart, revealing patches of bright blue sky for the first time in days. Evelyn paused beside a frozen stream where crystal-clear water still flowed beneath sheets of ice. She knelt to brush snow from several evergreen branches when she noticed something unusual across the narrow creek. Fresh tracks crossed the snow. They were much larger than ordinary wolf prints and far deeper than anything she had seen before. Yet only a few yards farther, the tracks simply disappeared. There was no sign of where the animal had gone. No return trail. No scattered snow. It was as though the forest itself had swallowed whoever had passed that way. She looked toward the wolf standing quietly behind her. Its golden eyes rested on the same place with thoughtful stillness. "Have you seen this before?" she asked softly. The wolf remained silent, then slowly turned its attention toward the mountains rising beyond the trees. Evelyn followed its gaze but saw nothing except endless white peaks glowing beneath the afternoon sun. On the walk home, another strange feeling settled over her. More than once she thought she heard footsteps behind them. Yet each time she stopped, only silence remained. Birds continued singing peacefully, and the branches barely moved. Still, the wolf occasionally lifted its head toward the distant hills, listening to sounds beyond Evelyn's hearing. That evening she prepared another simple meal while the fire crackled warmly inside the stone hearth. As darkness settled outside, she noticed the wolf rise from its place and walk toward the door. It paused there for several long seconds before gently pushing it with its nose. "Do you need to go outside?" she asked. The wolf looked back at her once, almost apologetically, before slipping into the snowy night. Evelyn waited by the window, expecting it to return within minutes. 1 hour passed, then another. Snow drifted steadily across the clearing until moonlight painted the entire forest silver. She wrapped herself in a blanket and remained awake longer than she intended, listening for familiar footsteps that never came. Just before dawn, exhaustion finally overcame her. When she opened her eyes again, pale morning light filled the cabin. The wolf was lying quietly beside the hearth exactly where it usually rested, its thick white coat dry and spotless, as though it had never ventured into the storm at all. Evelyn sat upright in surprise. She was certain she would have heard the door open if it had returned during the night. Even more puzzling, a fresh bundle of herbs rested neatly on the kitchen table beside a stack of split cedar logs. She slowly walked across the room, touching the fragrant leaves with her fingertips. They were herbs that grew only on the sunny slopes far above the valley, miles from her cabin and impossible to gather during the heart of winter. She turned toward the wolf, which simply watched her with calm golden eyes. "Who are you?" she whispered, not expecting an answer. The wolf lowered its head, but there was something different in its expression now, something almost wistful, as though it carried the weight of countless untold stories. Outside, hidden beyond the line of towering pines, several cloaked riders quietly observed the lonely cabin from a distant ridge. None of them moved closer. Their leader studied the smoke rising from the chimney before lowering his voice to little more than a breath. "He is here," he said, "but until he chooses to reveal himself, no one crosses that clearing." The quiet rhythm of the cabin changed with every passing day, although Evelyn Carter could not explain why. Winter still ruled the mountains, yet life inside the little home felt strangely fuller than it ever had before. The white wolf continued to recover with remarkable speed. Its movements had become graceful and confident, and there were moments when it seemed less like a wild creature seeking shelter and more like a silent guardian who had chosen to remain. Every morning, Evelyn woke to discover another impossible kindness waiting for her. Fresh water already filled the wooden barrel beside the door, even though the nearest spring remained nearly half a mile away beneath deep snow. Firewood always appeared neatly stacked before sunrise. Once, she even found the loose stones lining the narrow walkway arranged back into place after they had been scattered by the storm. She laughed softly to herself as she looked around the empty clearing. "If someone is trying to help me," she whispered into the crisp morning air, "I wish they would at least let me thank them." Only the wind answered. The wolf stood beside the porch, watching the surrounding forest with calm golden eyes before slowly turning its attention back to her. There was something almost knowing in its expression, enough to make Evelyn shake her head with an amused smile. "Do not look at me like that," she said. "You cannot possibly know who has been doing all of this." The wolf lowered its head, and for the briefest moment, she could have sworn it looked almost embarrassed. Later that afternoon, she decided to visit the small hill overlooking the valley. Carrying a basket filled with dried herbs, she hoped to trade once the roads reopened. The wolf followed at its usual respectful distance, leaving careful prints beside her own. The air had become warmer, and sunlight reflected across the snow with such brightness that the entire mountain seemed wrapped in silver. Halfway up the hill, Evelyn stopped to admire the view. The frozen river curved through the valley below like a ribbon of glass, while smoke drifted lazily from the chimneys of the distant village. Then something caught her attention. Far beyond the village, near the edge of the forest, several riders stood motionless on horseback. Their dark cloaks blended into the trees, but polished silver emblems flashed whenever sunlight touched them. They were too far away for Evelyn to recognize, yet they did not appear to be ordinary travelers. One of the riders slowly lifted a hand, pointing toward the mountains surrounding her cabin before the entire group disappeared behind the pines. A chill unrelated to the weather slipped through her. "That is unusual," she murmured. The wolf had already noticed them. It stood perfectly still, every muscle alert, its gaze fixed on the place where the riders had vanished. Evelyn looked down at the animal. "Do you think they are searching for someone?" The wolf did not move, but its silence somehow felt heavier than before. They returned home before sunset. As Evelyn prepared supper, she found herself glancing toward the windows more often than usual. The feeling that someone was quietly watching the cabin refused to disappear. It was not frightening, only strangely expectant, as though the mountains themselves were waiting for something important to happen. That night the sky cleared completely, revealing thousands of stars above the snow-covered forest. Moonlight poured across the clearing so brightly that shadows stretched like dark rivers between the trees. Evelyn woke sometime after midnight with the uneasy feeling that something had changed. The cabin was silent, too silent. She reached toward the hearth and immediately realized the place beside it was empty. The wolf was gone. She wrapped a blanket around her shoulders and carefully looked through the frosted window. At first she saw nothing. Then, standing near the old cedar where they had first met, she noticed the familiar white figure gazing toward the mountains. It stood with quiet dignity beneath the moonlight, almost glowing against the snow. Before Evelyn could open the door, another shape appeared at the edge of the clearing. It was not another wolf. It was the outline of a tall man wearing a long, dark cloak. The stranger stopped several yards away from the white wolf and slowly lowered his head in a gesture that looked unmistakably respectful. Evelyn blinked in disbelief. She rubbed the frost from the window with her sleeve, but when she looked again, the mysterious figure had vanished. Only the wolf remained beneath the cedar tree, watching the empty forest as though the silent meeting had never happened. Moments later, it calmly returned to the cabin, nudging the door open just enough to slip inside before lying down beside the hearth exactly as it always had. Evelyn stared at it for a long time without speaking. The questions that had quietly gathered over the past several days no longer felt like simple curiosities. Somewhere beyond the walls of her little cabin, invisible threads were beginning to weave together, and she could no longer shake the feeling that the lonely wolf she had rescued from the snow was standing at the very center of a story far greater than either of them could yet understand. The next sunrise arrived beneath a sky so clear that the mountains looked close enough to touch. Snow still covered every hillside, but the bitter edge of the storm had finally faded, leaving the forest wrapped in peaceful silence. Evelyn Carter stood on the porch with a steaming mug between her hands, watching tiny clouds of breath drift into the cold morning air. The white wolf rested a few feet away, its gaze fixed on the distant ridges as though it had been waiting for this day. There was an unusual stillness surrounding it, not the quiet of exhaustion, but the quiet of someone who had made an important decision. Evelyn noticed the change immediately. "You look like you are expecting visitors," she said with a gentle smile. The wolf slowly turned its golden eyes toward her before looking back at the mountains. Moments later, the silence broke. A deep horn echoed across the valley, followed by another, and then another, each call rolling through the forest like distant thunder. Birds lifted from the pine trees in startled waves. Evelyn placed her mug on the porch railing and listened carefully. The sound did not belong to hunters from the village. It carried a strange dignity that made the entire mountain seem to pause. Before long she saw them. Riders emerged from the snowy trail below, wearing dark cloaks fastened with polished silver clasps that reflected the morning sun. Their horses moved with perfect discipline, leaving neat lines across the untouched snow. At their head rode a broad-shouldered man with silver hair and calm blue eyes. As they approached the clearing, every rider stopped at exactly the same moment. None of them reached for a weapon. None spoke above a whisper. They simply looked toward the cabin with expressions filled not with suspicion, but with hope. Evelyn instinctively stepped forward. The white wolf walked past her and stood quietly in the center of the clearing. The riders immediately climbed down from their horses. To Evelyn's astonishment, every one of them lowered their heads in perfect respect toward the wolf. The silver-haired leader took one careful step forward before speaking in a voice filled with quiet relief. "We have searched every mountain, every valley, and every frozen river. We are grateful that we have finally found you, Your Majesty." Evelyn frowned in confusion. She glanced from the strangers to the wolf, expecting someone to laugh or explain the misunderstanding. Instead, complete silence settled across the clearing. The wolf lifted its head toward the sky. Warm sunlight spilled through the branches overhead, and a soft breeze carried loose snow from the pines. For one long heartbeat, nothing happened. Then a gentle shimmer of golden light surrounded the white wolf. Evelyn instinctively took a step back, her eyes wide with disbelief. The brilliant light flowed like sunlight across fresh snow, growing brighter until the familiar shape of the wolf slowly disappeared within it. The forest remained perfectly still. Even the horses stood quietly as though they had witnessed this moment many times before. When the golden light finally faded, the wolf was gone. Standing in its place was a tall man with dark hair touched by winter light and calm amber eyes that Evelyn recognized instantly. They were the same eyes that had watched her beside the fire, followed her through the forest, and listened silently while she spoke about lonely winters and forgotten dreams. He wore a dark coat trimmed with silver, and around one wrist rested a narrow leather band she had tied days earlier while tending the injured wolf. Nothing else needed to be explained. Evelyn looked at the familiar band, then into those unmistakable golden eyes. "It was you," she whispered, barely able to breathe. The man inclined his head with quiet gratitude. "Yes," he answered gently. "My name is Damien Ashford." The silver-haired captain immediately knelt before him, followed by every rider in the clearing. "Welcome home, Alpha King," they said together. Evelyn stood frozen beside her cabin as the impossible truth settled into her heart. The lonely creature she had rescued from the snow had never been an ordinary stray. The quiet companion who had accepted her kindness without a single word was the ruler an entire kingdom had been searching for, and through all those silent days he had allowed her to know him not as a king, but simply as someone who had found warmth in the home of a compassionate stranger. For several long moments, Evelyn Carter could only stand in silence, her heart struggling to accept what her eyes had witnessed. The man before her was no stranger. Every familiar glance, every quiet gesture, every patient moment beside the fire belonged to the same soul she had welcomed into her home without expecting anything in return. Damien Ashford stepped toward her with calm humility instead of royal pride. Although every rider remained kneeling behind him, his attention never left Evelyn. "You gave shelter to someone you believed had nothing to offer you," he said gently. "You shared your food when your own supplies were limited. You trusted kindness before fear. I will never forget that." Evelyn searched his face, finding the same warmth she had always recognized in the wolf's golden eyes. "You could have told me," she whispered softly. Damien smiled with quiet gratitude. "If I had arrived as a king, you would have treated me with courtesy. By arriving as a wounded traveler, I discovered your true heart." The words settled over the clearing like the first light of dawn. None of the riders interrupted. They watched the conversation with expressions of deep respect, understanding that what had happened inside the small cabin could never have been planned or commanded. The silver-haired captain finally rose and stepped forward. "Your Majesty," he said carefully, "the council has waited many days. Every territory has been searching for your return." Damien nodded once without taking his eyes from Evelyn. "They waited because they believed strength alone protects a kingdom," he answered calmly. "They needed to remember that compassion protects it as well." The captain lowered his head again. "Your lesson has been understood." Evelyn looked between them in growing disbelief. "You disappeared on purpose?" Damien turned toward her. "Not entirely. The storm changed my path, but what happened afterward became a gift that I never expected." He glanced toward the cabin, where gentle smoke still drifted from the chimney. "For the first time in many years I was seen not as a ruler, but simply as someone in need." Evelyn felt her cheeks grow warm. "I only did what anyone should have done." A faint smile touched several of the riders because they knew that was not true. Many would have closed their doors against an unknown wolf during the fiercest storm of the winter. Damien's expression softened even further. "That is exactly why your kindness matters," he replied. Before Evelyn could answer, another group of villagers slowly approached the clearing after following the unusual procession through the valley. They stopped in astonishment as they recognized Evelyn standing beside the Alpha King himself. The same neighbors who had questioned her decision only days before now stared silently at the scene unfolding before them. The elderly woman who had warned Evelyn against helping the wolf looked down with visible regret. The man who had insisted she should have left the animal in the forest removed his hat respectfully. No one spoke. Damien calmly faced the villagers without anger. "This woman welcomed a stranger when no one else was present to witness her choice," he said in a clear but gentle voice. "She asked for no reward. She expected no recognition. Remember that true character is revealed by what we do when no one believes it will matter." The villagers slowly turned toward Evelyn. Their expressions had completely changed. Where doubt had once existed, admiration quietly took its place. Evelyn shifted uncomfortably beneath their attention because praise had always felt unfamiliar to her. Damien seemed to understand immediately. He stepped slightly closer, allowing the focus to soften. "You never sought honor," he said quietly enough that only she could hear. "That is one reason you deserve it." Snowflakes drifted lazily from the branches above, sparkling in the afternoon light. The clearing no longer felt like the lonely place where she had discovered an exhausted wolf buried beneath the storm. It had become the place where hidden truths emerged without bitterness or revenge. No one was punished. No harsh words were spoken. Instead, understanding quietly replaced misunderstanding. The captain approached again, carrying a beautifully crafted cloak lined with white fur. He offered it to Damien with both hands, but the Alpha King accepted it only after turning toward Evelyn. Without hesitation, he gently placed the warm cloak across her shoulders instead. The surrounding riders exchanged surprised glances before smiling with quiet approval. "The mountain was cold when you welcomed me," Damien said. "Allow me to return a small part of the warmth you gave without hesitation." Evelyn looked down at the beautifully woven fabric before raising her eyes to meet his once again. The distance between a humble cabin and a royal throne suddenly felt much smaller than she had ever imagined, because the path connecting them had been built not by power or wealth, but by one simple act of compassion offered during the coldest night of winter. The news traveled through the valley faster than the melting streams of early spring. Before another sunrise had passed, every cottage, every workshop, and every mountain trail carried the same astonishing story. The quiet woman who had lived alone on the edge of the forest had offered shelter to the Alpha King without knowing his name or his crown. Yet the attention surrounding Evelyn Carter brought her little comfort. She had never wanted admiration. She missed the peaceful silence that had filled her cabin before strangers began stopping outside simply to catch a glimpse of her. Damien Ashford understood long before she spoke a single word. Standing beside the old cedar where their paths had first crossed, He watched the steady line of curious visitors winding toward the clearing before quietly turning to her. "You are overwhelmed," he said gently. Evelyn gave a small smile that carried both gratitude and uncertainty. "Everyone is looking at me differently now." Damien nodded. "Because they finally know what has always been true." She lowered her eyes. "I have not changed." "Exactly," he replied. "Only their understanding has." Those words remained with Evelyn throughout the day. Villagers who had once questioned her judgment now arrived carrying warm bread, fresh milk, handmade blankets, and baskets of winter vegetables. They apologized with sincere hearts, not because the Alpha King stood nearby, but because they had finally recognized the quiet strength they had overlooked for so long. The elderly woman who had first warned Evelyn against helping the injured wolf gently held her hands. "I judged your kindness before I understood it," she admitted. "Thank you for teaching us something our fear had made us forget." Evelyn squeezed her hands warmly. "We all learn at different times," she answered. "There is nothing to forgive." Damien watched the exchange from a respectful distance. The captain standing beside him smiled faintly. "She carries more grace than many nobles I have served," he observed. Damien's expression remained thoughtful. "That is why this kingdom needs her example." Later that afternoon, Damien asked Evelyn if she would walk with him through the forest one final time before returning to the royal capital. The familiar trail seemed transformed beneath the golden afternoon sunlight. Snow still rested beneath the pines, yet tiny streams had begun to break through the ice, filling the air with the quiet promise of spring. They walked side by side without haste, speaking as friends who no longer needed silence to hide the truth. Damien paused beside the frozen stream where Evelyn had once discovered the mysterious tracks that vanished into nothing. "Do you remember this place?" he asked. She laughed softly. "I remember thinking the forest was playing tricks on me." "The forest was protecting a secret," Damien answered with a warm smile. Evelyn looked toward the flowing water. "Were you watching me even then?" "Every moment after you opened your door," he admitted. "At first I remained because I needed time to recover. Then I remained because I had forgotten what it felt like to be treated simply as another soul deserving kindness." Evelyn's eyes softened. "You never felt like a burden." Damien looked toward the mountains stretching beyond the trees. "A crown often causes people to see responsibility before they see the person wearing it." He turned back to her. "Inside your cabin, I was not a king. I was only someone who needed warmth, and that gift reminded me of the ruler I wanted to become." They continued walking until they reached the ridge overlooking the valley. The same place where Evelyn had first noticed distant riders now stretched peacefully beneath the afternoon sky. Far below, smoke drifted lazily from village chimneys, while children laughed as they built snow figures outside their homes. Damien rested one hand against the weathered wooden fence marking the overlook. "There is something I wish to ask you," he said quietly. Evelyn waited patiently. "Will you visit the capital when spring arrives?" She looked at him with surprise. "Why me?" Damien smiled. "Because the people there deserve to meet the woman who reminded their king that compassion must always stand beside strength. I do not ask you to leave your home forever. I only ask you to let others learn from the kindness that changed mine." Evelyn remained silent for several moments before slowly nodding. "If my presence can help someone believe that kindness still matters, then I will come." Damien's smile carried unmistakable relief. As they began walking back toward the cabin, the setting sun painted the snowy mountains with shades of gold and amber. Neither of them noticed the flock of white birds rising above the valley until their shadows drifted peacefully across the ground. It felt less like an ending than the quiet beginning of a new season, one where titles mattered less than character, and where a simple act of mercy offered during the coldest night of winter continued to warm countless hearts long after the snow had begun to melt. Spring arrived quietly, almost as though the mountains themselves wished to honor the kindness that had changed so many lives. Snow slowly retreated from the valleys, revealing green grass, flowing streams, and fields dotted with the first wildflowers of the season. As promised, Evelyn Carter traveled to the royal capital, not as someone seeking recognition, but simply because she had given her word. The journey that once would have felt impossible became peaceful. Villagers stood along the roads, offering warm smiles instead of doubtful glances. Children waved excitedly whenever they recognized her, not because she wore an elegant cloak or traveled beside the Alpha King, but because they had heard the story of the woman who had chosen compassion over fear. When the great gates of the capital opened before them, Evelyn paused in quiet amazement. Towering stone walls reflected the morning sunlight, while colorful banners danced gently in the spring breeze. The city was grander than anything she had ever imagined. Yet Damien Ashford noticed the uncertainty in her expression and slowed his horse until they traveled side by side. "You do not have to become someone different here," he said softly. "The person you already are is exactly why I asked you to come." Evelyn smiled with grateful relief. "Then I will simply remain myself. That is all I have ever hoped for," Damien replied. The royal court gathered that afternoon inside a magnificent hall filled with sunlight pouring through tall windows. Nobles, council members, village representatives, and respected elders stood together as Damien addressed them. Instead of speaking first about victories, wealth, or power, he told the story of a lonely cabin hidden beneath winter snow. He described an ordinary woman who had opened her door to a freezing stranger without asking his name, his title, or what he could give her in return. Every voice in the hall faded into respectful silence. Damien finally turned toward Evelyn, who stood quietly near the front, still uncomfortable with so much attention. "A kingdom grows stronger through courage," he said clearly. "But courage without compassion becomes empty. The greatest lesson I learned this winter did not come from a throne or a battlefield. It came from a humble home where kindness was offered freely." Many members of the court lowered their heads thoughtfully. Others wiped quiet tears from their eyes. The words reached far beyond the palace walls. In the weeks that followed, travelers carried the story across neighboring kingdoms, inspiring families, merchants, and village leaders alike. People began helping strangers with greater generosity, remembering that they could never truly know whose life they might be changing. Evelyn returned often to her little cabin in the mountains because it would always feel like home. Damien visited whenever his duties allowed, leaving behind royal ceremonies for peaceful afternoons beside the same stream where mysterious footprints had once vanished into the snow. They planted young pine trees together along the edge of the clearing, believing that one day travelers would rest beneath their shade. The cabin itself remained almost unchanged. The wooden table where Evelyn had shared her last pieces of bread still stood beside the window. The stone hearth where a tired white wolf had once slept continued warming the room every winter. Whenever visitors asked why the Alpha King treasured such a simple place, Damien always smiled before answering. "Because this is where I remembered who I was." Seasons continued to change. Children who had once listened wide-eyed to the remarkable tale eventually told it to their own families. The story never focused on a magical transformation or a royal title for very long. Instead, people remembered the quiet decision made during one freezing night when no audience was watching. They remembered that true greatness had arrived wearing the appearance of someone helpless, and true kindness had answered without hesitation. Years later, travelers passing through the valley often noticed a carved wooden sign near the old cabin. It carried only a few simple words. "Kindness is never wasted." Those who stopped to read it sometimes smiled before continuing their journey, unaware that the message had been inspired by the greatest love story the mountains had ever witnessed. And whenever fresh snow covered the forest each winter, villagers would glance toward the peaceful cabin with grateful hearts, remembering that the coldest night of one season had become the warmest memory of countless lives, proving that true strength is gentle, true honor is humble, and the smallest act of compassion can quietly change the destiny of an entire kingdom.